Hello there. Tonight we'll wander back about 1,000 years to a little Norse settlement on the northern tip of what we now call Newfoundland. 3 turf-walled longhouses above a curving pebble bay, a single wooden gnar pulled up on the shingle, and dark spruce forest on the far shore. This is where the Vikings landed in America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. We'll wander through the meadow in the soft light of a late afternoon, and I'll tell you how they came to be here. And by the way, if you'd like more stories like this one, you might want to check out our app. It's called Tonight, and it has fresh stories for you every day, so there's always something new to fall asleep to. Plus, you can hear them in your favorite voice. It's a free download. The link's just below this video. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Get comfortable, however that looks for you tonight. When you're ready, close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose, and a long, slow breath out. One more. In and out. The story of how the Norse reached the shores of North America begins in the cold, green seas of the North Atlantic more than 1,000 years ago. Long before any other Europeans set foot on the continent, a small group of sailors crossed an open ocean in wooden ships and built a turf-walled settlement on the northern tip of what is now Newfoundland. They stayed only a few short years, then they left, and the memory of the place slowly faded from the wider world for nearly a millennium. The voyagers who made the journey were Norse, the seafaring farmers and traders of Scandinavia, the people we sometimes call Vikings. In their own time, they were known by the regions they came from: Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. By the early 9th century, they had begun to sail further and further from home. Some went east, down the great rivers of what is now Russia, all the way to the Black Sea and Constantinople. Some went south, to the British Isles and the coasts of France and Spain. And some went west, into the open Atlantic. The western route was the slowest to develop. The ocean there is wide and empty. There are no friendly coasts to follow. A ship that sets out west from Norway is, after a few days, alone on the sea. But the Norse had the ships to manage it, and, little by little, they began to explore this vast new frontier. By around the year 870, Norse settlers had reached Iceland. The island was almost empty when they arrived, apart from a handful of Irish monks who had been living there in quiet seclusion. The monks soon left. The Norse stayed, and over the following decades they built a nation of farms and fishing harbors across the green volcanic plains. For about a century, Iceland was the furthest west the Norse world reached. And then, in the late 970s, a man named Erik the Red came to the edge of that world and was pushed beyond it. Erik had a difficult life in Iceland. He'd moved there from Norway as a boy, after his father had been outlawed for killing a man. In Iceland, Erik himself was outlawed twice for similar disputes. Outlawry in the Norse world was a kind of legal exile. A man could be sentenced to leave the country for a set number of years, and anyone who killed him during that time could not be prosecuted. It was a serious punishment, but a survivable one if a man had a ship. Erik had a ship, and he'd heard a rumor, told by an Icelandic sailor who had been blown off course years before, of a land further west, beyond the open sea. In the year 982, when Erik was sentenced to 3 years of exile, He decided to sail there and see what he could find. He found a vast island, larger than any he'd ever seen, with deep, cold fjords cutting into a high, white interior. The coast was sheltered in places. The grass grew at the heads of the fjords. There were seals and walrus and good pasture for cattle. Erik spent his 3 years exploring it. He sailed up its long western coast. He picked the 2 best places for farms in the sheltered inner fjords. And when his exile ended, he sailed back to Iceland with the news and with a name for the new country. He called it Greenland. The chroniclers noted, even at the time, that he had chosen the name partly to attract settlers. A green land would sound more inviting than an icy one. The name worked. In the summer of 985, Erik led a fleet of 25 ships westward out of Iceland. 14 of them made the crossing. The rest were lost or turned back. The survivors landed at the head of 2 fjords on the southwestern coast. Erik built his own farm at a place he called Brattahlíð, on a slope above quiet water, looking out across pasture toward the inland ice. Over the next few generations, the Greenland settlements grew. At their peak, they may have held several thousand people on a few hundred small farms. They built churches of stone. They raised cattle and sheep and goats. They hunted seals in the spring and walrus in the long northern summers. And they traded the ivory of the walrus tusks all the way back to Europe, where it was prized by carvers and cathedral builders. Upon its discovery, Greenland became, for a time, the new western edge of the European world. But it was not the end of the journey. In the same summer that Erik led his fleet west, a young Icelandic trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing his own ship from Norway to Iceland to spend the winter with his father. When he reached Iceland, he learned that his father had already left for Greenland with Erik's expedition. Bjarni decided to follow. He set out late in the season with a crew who, by his own admission, had no idea where Greenland actually was. They sailed for 3 days in fair weather, and then a thick fog came down, and the wind shifted, and for many days they drifted without sight of sun or stars. When the weather finally cleared, they saw land, but it was not the land they were expecting. The coast they sighted was low and wooded, with no mountains and no glaciers. Bjarni, a careful man, understood at once that he'd sailed past Greenland. He turned the ship and sailed north along the coast, and then he saw another country, this one flat and forested as well. And then a third, with bare, stony hills and almost no trees at all. His crew wanted to go ashore. There would be timber, they pointed out, and Greenland had almost none. There might be water and game. But Bjarni refused. He was a trader, not an explorer. He wanted to find his father. So he turned the ship east, sailed for 4 more days, and at last reached Greenland and the family farm. He told the story of the lands he had seen. People listened with interest, but no one was willing to explore further. Bjarni himself, in time, sailed home to Norway, where he told the story again at the court of a powerful jarl, the Norse word for an earl. The jarl, the saga says, mildly criticized him for not having gone ashore. And there, for nearly 15 years, the matter rested. The man who eventually took up the story was named Leif Erikson. He was the second son of Erik the Red, and he'd grown up at Brattahlíð, listening to the talk of sailors. Sometime around the year 1000, he traveled to Norway, where he spent a winter at the court of King Olaf and converted to Christianity. When he returned to Greenland, he carried with him the new faith and a quiet ambition to see the lands Bjarni had described. He bought Bjarni's old ship and gathered a crew of 35 men. It was the very vessel that had drifted to the unknown coasts. His father Erik intended to come along as the leader by tradition. But on the day of departure, the old man fell from his horse on the way down to the harbor and hurt his foot. He took it as a sign and stayed behind. The ship Life sailed in was called a nar. It's worth pausing on the ship for a moment, because its design is the reason any of this was possible at all. The nar was a broad, deep, cargo-carrying vessel, shorter and rounder than the long, narrow warships the Vikings are usually pictured in. It was built for the open ocean. The hull was made of overlapping oak planks, fastened with iron rivets and sealed with tarred animal hair. This style of construction is called clinker building, and it produces a hull that is both light and strong, and that flexes slightly with the sea instead of fighting against it. The keel, the long central timber along the bottom, was usually carved from a single straight oak tree. The mast was set into a heavy wooden block amidships and could be raised and lowered with the wind. The ship had a single square sail, woven from wool. Norse women spent enormous amounts of time spinning and weaving these sails. A single sail for an ocean-going ship could take several people more than a year to make. The wool was greased with tallow or sheep fat to shed water, and dyed in strong red and white stripes for visibility at sea. The ship was steered by a single oar, mounted on the right side of the stern. That is the reason the English language still calls the right-hand side of a boat starboard, from the Old Norse word stýriborði, the side where the steering oar was. There were oars for rowing in calm weather and for moving in and out of harbor, but on the open sea, the nar sailed by the wind alone. The crew of around 30 people traveled with their cargo on the open deck, sheltered only by wool blankets and sealskin sacks. They cooked on shore when they could and ate cold food at sea. Dried fish, hard bread, smoked meat, butter, sour milk that had been preserved by careful fermentation. Fresh water was carried in wooden casks. The casks did not last long. On a crossing of several weeks, water became precious by the end. They had no compass. The compass would not reach northern Europe for another 2 centuries. They navigated by older methods, but methods that worked. They followed the sun. They watched the height of the noon sun above the horizon and tried to stay along the same latitude, to keep, as they put it, on the same line. There is some evidence that they used a simple wooden device, a kind of sunboard, to measure the shadow of a peg at midday and check whether they were drifting north or south. At night they read the stars, especially the pole star, which holds nearly still in the northern sky, while the rest of the heavens turn around it. The height of the pole star above the horizon gave another check on latitude. The color of the water told them more. Paler over shallow shelves, greener near river mouths. They watched the birds. A flock of seabirds flying in one direction in the evening usually meant land lay that way, because the birds were going home to roost. There is a famous saga story of an early sailor who took 3 ravens with him on a voyage. When the first raven flew back, he knew land was behind him. When the second one circled and returned to the ship, he knew none was near. And when the third flew on and did not return, he followed it and found Iceland. They watched the swells and the way the wind smelled, and the way the air felt cold or moist or laden with the breath of ice. None of this was magic. It was knowledge, kept in the heads of skilled sailors, passed down from voyage to voyage. The route Leif chose was the reverse of the one Bjarni had drifted. From the Greenland settlements he sailed north up the coast, then turned west across the strait, and made for the bare, stony land Bjarni had seen last. He found it, a coast of flat rocks and no grass, with great glaciers behind. He went ashore, found nothing useful, and named the country Helluland, which meant the land of flat stones. Today, most historians believe it was Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. He sailed south. After some days, he came to a second coast, lower, sandier, thickly forested. He went ashore there too. The trees were a treasure in themselves. In Greenland, where almost nothing grew taller than a man, timber was the rarest and most valuable building material. Leif named this country Markland, which meant forest land. It was almost certainly the coast of what we now call Labrador. He kept going south. 2 more days passed, and at last he came to a third country, where the climate was milder, the land was greener, and the rivers ran full of salmon. Here he decided to stop and spend the winter. He named the country Vinland, Wineland, because, the sagas say, one of his crew, a German named Tyrkir, found wild grapes growing there. There has been a great deal of debate over the centuries about whether grapes really grew on the coast where Leif settled. Some scholars think the word may have referred to a different kind of berry, perhaps wild currants. Others think the climate 1,000 years ago was a little warmer than it is now, and that wild vines may indeed have reached further north than they do today. Either way, the name stuck. Leif and his men built houses there, of wood and turf, and stayed through the winter. The winters were mild compared to Greenland. The days were longer in midwinter than they were at home. There was abundant timber, abundant water, abundant fish. In the spring, they cut a cargo of wood, loaded it onto the ship, and sailed back to Greenland. The voyage had taken, all told, perhaps a year and a half. Leif never went back. When he returned to Brattahlid, his father had died, and Leif inherited the family farm and the position that went with it. He had other things to do. but he gave permission to his brothers and to others to use his houses in the new country if they wished to sail there themselves. His brother Thorvald went next and explored further along the coast. A second brother, Thorstein, tried to follow him and was driven back by bad weather. And then, a few years later, a wealthier Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni organized a much larger expedition with 3 ships and around 160 people, including a number of women and a quantity of livestock. Thorfinn intended to settle there permanently. Thorfinn's wife was a remarkable woman named Gudrid. She'd already crossed the Atlantic several times, and she would later become one of the most traveled women of the Middle Ages. Their son, Snorri, was born during the expedition. He was, as far as anyone knows, the first child of European descent to be born in the Americas, about 500 years before Columbus. The settlement they chose, almost certainly, was the place we now call Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in eastern Canada. The site sits on a low, grassy meadow above a curving, pebbled bay, looking out across a shallow strait to the dark forests of Labrador. Behind the meadow, low hills rise gently. A small stream runs through it to the sea. It is exposed to the wind, but it is sheltered from the worst of the swells. And it is, by Norse standards, a reasonable place to land a ship. The settlement they built there was small, but carefully arranged. There were 3 main longhouses, set in a row a short distance from the shore. Each was a long, narrow building of turf walls, with a sod roof above wooden rafters. The walls were strips of grass-covered earth stacked and packed into thick, insulating layers. The walls were perhaps 6 feet thick. Inside, a single long hall ran the length of the building, with a central hearth down the middle, and raised earthen benches along the side walls, where the people sat and worked by day and slept by night. The largest of the 3 houses had several rooms, including private chambers at one end, suggesting that the leader of the expedition lived there. The smaller 2 were simpler. Around the longhouses stood a number of smaller workshops. There was a carpenter's shed, with wood chips and shavings preserved in the soil. There was a small hut where boats were repaired. And, most striking of all, there was a small ironworking shed, with a clay and stone furnace, where the Norse could smelt iron from the iron-rich nodules that form in northern peat bogs. They produced a small quantity of iron there. They forged it into nails, probably for repairing the ships. It is the earliest known ironworking in the Americas. What the settlement was used for is still a subject of careful study. Most scholars now think it was not a town or a colony in the ordinary sense, but a base camp, a place where Norse expeditions could overwinter, repair their ships, gather timber and food, and use as a staging point for further voyages along the coast. Butternuts, which do not grow in Newfoundland, have been found at the site, suggesting that someone there had traveled at least as far south as New Brunswick or Maine to gather them. The settlement may have been in active use only for about 10 years. A daily life at the camp would have looked, in many ways, like daily life on any small Norse farm. The fire in the main hearth would have been kept burning, more or less continuously, for cooking and warmth. The cooking was simple: boiled meat and fish, porridge of barley or oats, dried and salted provisions brought from home, supplemented by whatever could be hunted and gathered locally. There was wool to be spun. A small carved stone disc, used as a weight on a hand spindle, was found at the site, indicating that women were among the inhabitants. There were tools to be sharpened, nets to be mended, ropes to be twisted, planks to be cut. The light in the longhouses by night came from the hearth fire and from small soapstone oil lamps burning seal oil or whale oil. The smoke drifted out through a hole in the roof. The walls were thick and the doors were heavy. In winter, the buildings would have been smoky and dim and warm. In summer, with the doors propped open, they would have been cooler, and the meadow outside would have been bright with grass and wildflowers and the long northern light. What the Norse did not have at Meadows, and what eventually proved decisive, was peace with the people who already lived there. North America in the year 1000 was not empty. The land the Norse had named Vinland had been inhabited for many thousands of years. The peoples living along that part of the coast included the ancestors of the modern Beothuk, the Innu, and the Mi'kmaq. The Norse called them by a single name: Skraelings, a word whose exact meaning is no longer certain. The sagas describe encounters between the two groups. The first encounters, the stories say, were peaceful enough. There was trade. The local people brought furs to exchange. The Norse offered cloth and milk products, which the locals hadn't tasted before, and which, the sagas note, they especially liked. For a short time, the two groups met at the edge of the meadow and bartered without trouble. But the meetings did not stay peaceful. There were misunderstandings, then quarrels, then small fights. The Norse were heavily outnumbered. They were a long way from home, with no way to bring reinforcements. And the people who lived there had every reason to be wary of strangers building houses on their land. After a few years, Thorfinn and his people decided to leave. The sagas are clear about the reason. Thorfinn was an experienced and pragmatic man. He could see that the camp was not going to grow into a lasting settlement, not against a population that did not want them there. So he loaded his ships with timber and furs and sailed back to Greenland. From Greenland he sailed on to Iceland, and then to Norway, and then home to Iceland again, where he and Gudrid bought a farm and lived quietly for the rest of their lives. After Thorfinn, the sagas mention only a few more voyages, and then no more. The houses at Meadows stood empty. The turf walls, untended, slowly slumped. The roofs collapsed. The grass grew back over the floors. The fire pits filled with leaves and silt. The bay returned to silence. And by the time another century had passed, the place looked, from the sea, like any other empty meadow on a northern coast. The voyages were not entirely forgotten. The Norse remembered them, in the way they remembered most of their history, in stories told around the hearths of farms in Iceland and Greenland and Norway, repeated from one generation to the next. In time, the stories were gathered together and written down. Two of these written sagas survive. They are called the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red. Both were composed in Iceland, probably in the 13th century, about 200 years after the events they describe. They do not agree on every detail. The order of the voyages is different in each one. Some of the names differ. Some of the episodes appear in one and not the other. This is exactly what one would expect from oral history, written down centuries late. The bones of the tale are the same, but the dressing varies. For most of the long centuries that followed, the sagas were read in Iceland and admired as literature. But they were not taken seriously as history. The lands they described, Helluland, Markland, Vinland, seemed too vague, too far away, too tangled with the rest of the Norse storytelling about distant places. Scholars in the wider European world treated the voyages, when they thought of them at all, as legend. Then, in the early 19th century, the sagas began to be translated and studied more carefully. Antiquarians in Scandinavia and North America argued, on the strength of the texts, that the Norse had indeed reached America. Others were skeptical. Without any physical evidence on the ground, the debate could not be settled. The physical evidence took a long time to find. There were false starts. A famous one was the Kensington runestone, a slab of stone uncovered in Minnesota in the late 19th century, carved with what looked like medieval Norse runes. Most scholars now consider it a modern forgery. Other claimed Norse artifacts in North America have also turned out to be later in date, or simply misidentified. The true breakthrough came from a Norwegian explorer and writer named Helge Ingstad, working with his wife, the archaeologist Anna Stina Ingstad. Helge had spent years studying the sagas and trying to identify from the descriptions of coastlines and currents and sailing times where Vinland had actually been. He concluded that the best fit was somewhere along the northern coast of Newfoundland. In 1960, he sailed there, working his way along the coast in a small boat, asking local people whether they knew of any old ruins on the shore. At a small fishing village called Meadows, a fisherman named George Decker took him to a low grassy area not far from the bay. There were faint rectangular ridges in the meadow. the kind of slight humps that might mean a long collapsed wall, or might mean nothing at all. The locals had known about the ridges for generations. They had assumed they were the remains of an old fishing camp. Helga and Anna Stina began to excavate. They worked over several summers with a small international team. Slowly, season by season, the outlines of the buildings emerged. 3 longhouses emerged. Several smaller workshops appeared beside them. A small iron smelting site lay nearby. A scattering of artifacts. The spindle whorl. A small bronze cloak pin in the Norse style. A stone oil lamp. Iron nails. The wood chips of a carpentry shed. Radiocarbon dating placed the site firmly around the year 1000. It was, beyond reasonable doubt, a Norse settlement. The first archaeological proof that the Vikings had reached the Americas. The site was declared a national park, and later a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the first of its kind in North America. Since then, further work has refined the picture. Tree ring dating of wooden objects from the site, published in 2021, even allowed researchers to identify a single specific year, 1021, in which Norse people were certainly cutting wood at Meadows. It is the earliest exact date for any European presence in the Americas. The settlement remains a quiet place. Reconstructed buildings stand on the meadow today, low and turf-walled and humble, looking out across the same shallow water that Leif and Thorfinn would have seen. The wind comes in off the sea, just as it did then. The grass grows. The bay curves the way it has always curved. The dark spruce forest lines the far shore. The Norse voyages did not change the course of history the way later European voyages did. They were small and brief. They produced no lasting colony, no chain of new settlements, no broad meeting of worlds. For nearly 500 years after they ended, no other Europeans came back. But they were there. Real people, on real ships, made the crossing, and built the houses, and walked in the meadow, and went home again. And for a few short years, around the year 1000, the long human chain that had spread out of Africa and around the world, east through Asia, across the land bridge into the Americas, around the Pacific, through Europe, and at last across the open North Atlantic, closed in on itself for the first time at a small turf-walled camp on a quiet northern bay. The meadow is quiet now. The wind moves through the grass. The turf walls sit low and worn. The bay is empty. The spruce forest stands dark on the far shore,